The Josh Jacobs scenario. What would happen if an elite RB left Green Bay for outside the NFL? Imagine this. One of the most dominant running backs in football walks away from a massive NFL contract to chase something completely different. The Packers are left stunned. The league is left confused. The owners? They're furious. But here's what makes this story actually interesting. It's not about the money. It's about a player deciding the NFL wasn't worth the cost anymore. And that changes everything about how owners think. Not a trade, not a retirement, not a free agency move to another NFL team. It's a star player signing outside the league entirely, walking away from the structure, the hierarchy, and the control that the NFL imposes on elite athletes. This is the story of what would happen if Josh Jacobs, in the peak of his career, decided that the grass was genuinely greener somewhere else. We're breaking down the domino effect, why the Packers would be caught off guard, why NFL owners would collectively lose their minds, what this would mean for player autonomy in the modern era, and how one decision could reshape the entire power dynamic between athletes and the league itself. This is the scenario that keeps NFL executives awake at night. Here's what we think actually unfolds. Let's establish the hypothetical clearly. Josh Jacobs, in his prime, elite athleticism, proven production, still ascending in his career, receives an offer from a professional football organization outside the NFL. We're talking about a league with international reach, comparable investment capital, and, most importantly, different contractual structures, different player control, and different long-term stability guarantees. Here's what we believe would be running through his mind. The NFL's model is fundamentally exploitative for running backs specifically. The position has a short shelf life. The wear and tear is documented and catastrophic. Career-ending injuries can happen on any play. And the NFL, as a league, has shown it will extract maximum value from a player's body and discard them when they're no longer productive.
Compare that to what an international professional league could offer. Multi-year guaranteed contracts without the same injury risk multiplier, a more controlled playing schedule, broader endorsement opportunities globally, and crucially, the ability to walk away with dignity and a full financial guarantee, regardless of health status. From a pure business standpoint, if you're a running back in 2024, the question becomes, why take the NFL's deal at all? The injury profile is worse. The guaranteed money is less stale. The career longevity projections are bleak. An elite RB could potentially sign with a foreign league, earn comparable money with better guarantees, establish an international brand, and protect his long-term health in a way the NFL simply doesn't allow. This is the fundamental calculation we're imagining. Josh Jacobs, not because he hates football, but because he's read the actuarial data, decides the risk-reward of the NFL no longer makes sense. Now let's analyze what the Packers front office would be facing. They've invested significant resources into Jacobs. They've built offensive schemes around his skill set. They've made financial commitments. And suddenly, they're staring at a press release. Jacobs has signed a multi-year deal with a professional league outside the NFL structure. The initial response from Green Bay's front office would likely be denial mixed with urgency. Here's why. A star player leaving for outside the NFL isn't just a roster gap. It's a philosophical challenge to the entire NFL system. If one elite player walks, what does that signal to others? Does it open a valve that's supposed to be sealed? From the Packers' perspective, they'd be calculating. How much of their offensive system was dependent on Jacobs' specific skill profile? How quickly can they pivot to alternative running back solutions? What's the salary cap impact of losing a star player versus backfilling the position? How do they explain to fans that a franchise asset chose to leave not through trade or free agency, but through defection? The last point is crucial. Free agency is controlled. Trades are controlled. Defection, a player deciding the entire structure isn't worth it, that's unpredictable and terrifying from an organizational standpoint. The Packers would have to immediately begin a contingency plan while simultaneously protecting their public image. Internally, the conversation would be uncomfortable. What does it say about our organization that a star player preferred to leave professional football entirely rather than stay? Is it a reflection on coaching, front office, the physical demands we place on him? The Packers would be forced into introspection while simultaneously having to move forward. Here's where this scenario becomes genuinely threatening to the NFL establishment, the owner's perspective. We're talking about 32 billionaires who've built their wealth on the premise that they control the supply of elite athletic labor. The entire NFL business model is predicated on artificial scarcity. There are only 32 teams, only a limited number of star players, and owners capture most of the economic value because athletes have no alternative.
But if Josh Jacobs can walk away to a professional league outside the NFL with comparable or better financial terms, that fundamentally breaks the scarcity model. Suddenly, players do have an alternative, and alternatives mean negotiating power. The owner class would view this scenario with genuine panic. Here's what we believe their initial reaction would be.
First, legal threats. The NFL would immediately explore whether any contractual mechanisms could be leveraged against Jacobs. Collective bargaining agreement violations, league bylaws, anything to create a legal barrier to his departure. Second, economic pressure. The league might collectively signal to international football organizations, if you sign NFL players, we will respond. This could manifest as blocking future international partnerships, refusing to acknowledge international league records, or other retaliatory measures. Third, media narrative control. The NFL would likely seed stories positioning Jacobs' departure as a failure, a cautionary tale, or a sign of weakness. They would not allow this to be portrayed as a rational player choice. Fourth, preventative measures. The owners would likely huddle to discuss how to make it contractually impossible for this to happen again, perhaps through stricter language around exclusivity, non-compete clauses, or other mechanisms that further restrict player autonomy. The fundamental fear driving all of this, if one elite player leaves voluntarily and that player is successful and happy outside the NFL, the entire control structure becomes vulnerable. Other players might do the same. The talent pipeline becomes unpredictable. The owner's monopoly weakens. What makes this scenario genuinely interesting from a structural standpoint is what it would mean for player autonomy more broadly. Josh Jacobs wouldn't just be leaving the Packers, he'd be leaving the entire NFL system and implicitly challenging the premise that the NFL is the only path to professional football success and validation. Here's what we believe the long-term implications would be. If Jacobs thrives outside the NFL, it creates a precedent. Young players coming up would see that alternative as viable. The threat of free agents leaving the league entirely becomes real in negotiating scenarios. Give me the contract I want, or I walk to the International League becomes a legitimate tactic.
This shifts enormous power from ownership to labor. It's precisely what the owner class wants to prevent at all costs. But here's the deeper layer. The broader sports business universe would be watching. If a professional football league outside the NFL can attract and maintain an elite player, it validates the entire model. Investment capital flows differently. Media attention follows. International soccer leagues already operate on a model where players have mobility across leagues and countries. What if professional football operated the same way? The Packers would be caught in the middle of this macro shift. They'd lose their player. They'd lose the certainty that comes with the NFL's closed ecosystem. And they'd be forced to operate in a new landscape where player retention isn't automatic. It has to be earned through actual quality of life, organizational culture, and financial terms that compete with alternatives. This is the fundamental threat that would have owner meetings running late into the night. From a practical standpoint, let's analyze what Jacobs' departure would mean for the Packers' roster construction and long-term planning. Losing an elite running back in his prime isn't just a one-year gap, it's a strategic recalibration. The Packers would have several options. First, draft replacement at running back. This commits next year's draft capital to a position that was supposed to be solved. It signals urgency, which typically leads to reaching, which typically leads to overdrafting based on need rather than talent. Second, free agency pivot. The running back free agent market is typically thin at the elite level. The Packers might overpay for a secondary talent or combine multiple mid-tier backs to approximate Jacobs' production. This strains the salary cap in other areas. Third, system adjustment. The Packers could theoretically redesign their offensive scheme to de-emphasize the running back role, moving toward a pass-heavy spread-style attack. This works if your quarterback is elite. It's more problematic if he's not. The deeper issue is the uncertainty this introduces. When you lose a star player through choice, not circumstance, it creates a psychological domino effect. Other players wonder, if Jacobs could leave, why can't I? Suddenly, retention anxiety spreads through the roster. The front office has to work harder to convince existing players that staying is the right move. Green Bay's organizational stability, which is one of the franchise's core strengths, would be tangibly shaken. That's not just about talent replacement, it's about culture and certainty.
We need to think about how the national media landscape would process this scenario. Sports media operates on established narratives: championships, dramatic trades, free agency moves, draft surprises. A player leaving for outside professional football, that's outside the established narrative toolkit. Here's what we believe would happen. Initial confusion, followed by rapid narrative consolidation. National outlets would struggle to cover a story that fundamentally challenges their beat. They don't have sources in international professional football. They don't have relationships with those organizations. The story becomes harder to report on, which means less coverage. The NFL would use this to their advantage. Reduced coverage means reduced exposure for the defection story. It means the narrative doesn't metastasize into other players' consciousness. It becomes yesterday's news quickly. But for Packers-specific media, the wound stays open longer. Wisconsin fans would be grappling with this reality. A franchise asset chose to leave. That's a story that doesn't go away in one market. It lingers. It becomes part of the organizational mythology, the year they lost Jacobs to the world. From a retention and engagement standpoint for Packers fans, this is genuinely damaging. The narrative isn't we traded him for future assets or we let him walk to free agency. It's he rejected the entire structure we represent. Let's zoom out to divisional implications. The Packers losing an elite running back while remaining in the NFC North creates a relative power shift. Competing teams, Vikings, Lions, Bears, suddenly have a talent advantage they didn't engineer themselves. It's like winning a lottery without playing. The Vikings could potentially dominate the running game more decisively. The Lions could use their own ground game as a comparative strength. The Bears, historically weak at running back, suddenly look less disadvantaged. This isn't just about roster talent. It's about the psychological edge in divisional games. If Packers fans and players know their run game is compromised, that becomes a pressure point opponents exploit. It subtly shifts game scripts. What was once a strength becomes a question mark. And from a draft capital standpoint, the Packers are spending future picks to solve a problem that didn't have to exist. Those picks could have been used to strengthen other positions. Instead, they're reactive, playing catch-up. The domino effect ripples through multiple seasons. By the time Green Bay stabilizes at running back, the Vikings and Lions might have created enough distance that the division dynamic has fundamentally shifted.
Here's what we believe happens in the weeks and months after Jacobs' departure. The Packers front office has to reconcile two realities. Reality 1, Jacobs was a great player, and losing him hurts. Reality 2, the fact that he could leave at all, and wanted to leave, suggests something deeper about the organization, the league structure, or the value proposition being offered. This is where front offices split into two camps. Those who blame the player, he made a crazy choice, chased money elsewhere, didn't understand his opportunity, and those who use it as an impetus for self-reflection. We believe the smarter front office, and the Packers have historically been led by thoughtful decision-makers, would ask hard questions. Are we maximizing player welfare? Are our contract structures competitive with what's available globally? Are we creating a culture where stars want to stay, not just where they're contractually obligated to stay? These are uncomfortable questions for an NFL organization to ask. The entire league is built on the assumption that the NFL is the premium product and players should be grateful to be there. That assumption becomes harder to maintain if your players are literally choosing to leave for alternatives. From a financial perspective, the Packers would have to absorb the loss. Depending on contract structure, there might be cap implications. There would definitely be opportunity cost, resources spent on replacement rather than team improvement. The bottom line impact is real, but the philosophical reckoning is bigger. What does it mean that a player chose to leave? And what does the organization need to change to ensure it doesn't happen again? Here's what the Josh Jacobs scenario would actually represent. A star player in his prime looks at the risk-reward proposition of the NFL and decides it no longer makes sense. He signs with a professional league outside the structure, offering better guarantees, less injury risk, and comparable financial terms. The Packers are caught off guard and forced into emergency roster recalibration. The owner class enters full panic mode because a player walking away proves that alternatives to the NFL monopoly exist. Player autonomy shifts fundamentally. If Jacobs can leave, so can others. The threat becomes real. National media struggles to cover a story outside their established narrative framework. Green Bay's divisional competitors suddenly have relative advantages they didn't earn. Green Bay's front office confronts uncomfortable questions about culture, compensation, and player welfare. The financial impact is real. The philosophical impact is bigger. And across the league, owners realize their assumed monopoly on elite athletic labor is weaker than they believed. One player's choice to leave shatters the premise that the NFL is the only viable professional destination. That threat, more than any trade, any free agency loss, any draft miss, is what would terrify the owner class, because it suggests that the entire system is more fragile than they want to admit.
Let's be direct about what this scenario would ultimately mean. Josh Jacobs choosing to leave the Packers for professional football outside the NFL would represent a fundamental shift in how players view their relationship to the league. It wouldn't be about money alone. It would be about autonomy, safety, and the realization that the NFL's monopoly on professional football opportunity isn't actually a monopoly anymore. The Packers would lose an elite running back in his prime. They'd lose certainty about roster stability. They'd lose the narrative control they typically maintain. They'd face tough questions about organizational culture and player welfare. They'd spend draft capital and cap space solving a problem that didn't have to exist. They'd experience a relative power shift in the NFC North, and they'd be forced to confront the reality that their organizational structure, which has historically been a strength, suddenly feels less attractive to elite players than alternatives elsewhere.
The owner class would lose something bigger, the illusion of control. Once a player walks away to viable alternatives, the negotiating dynamic fundamentally shifts. Retention becomes something that has to be earned, not assumed. That's the real threat. This is why in the actual NFL, you'll never see this scenario play out without massive legal, financial, and reputational warfare. The league and ownership would do everything possible to prevent it, not because they care about individual owners' roster problems, but because they understand the systemic threat. One player leaving to pursue professional football outside the NFL structure doesn't just weaken one franchise, it weakens the entire premise on which the NFL operates.